Okay, it's the 2nd of January, 2021. This is Saturday. Before we get started, just a note to click on the notification bell in the upper right, outside of the screen that shows me, but up there in the YouTube border. It's up there on the YouTube screen in the upper right, a notification bell. Click that, and then you'll be alerted when I have new videos. And today's video is going to be about what I call the sinister aspects of President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Much of what I'm going to talk about is covered in this book, The Confederacy at Flood Tide. And if you want to get a copy of this book, it's $28. It's my book. It's $28 at Amazon.com and other bookstores like Barnes and Noble. You can get them at any bookstore. If they don't have it, they'll order it. If you want to buy it online, Amazon and Barnes and Noble are both. They can get it there promptly from each of them. $28. If, however, you would like to get a signed copy, I do have a few here that I can sign, and I will send them to you if you're in the United States, and I will cover shipping. My price, however, for a signed copy will be $31, and I will cover the shipping cost. If that's something that interests you, email me, Phil, P-H-I-L _Leigh, L-E-I-G-H at me.com. Okay, so let me bring up my notes on what I want to talk about here, the dark side of emancipation. While today's Americans celebrate that the last slaves in the United States were freed over 150 years ago, few students of the war between the states appreciate that there was a dark side to the September 22nd, 1862 Emancipation Proclamation. To be sure, most are aware that President Lincoln's executive order had doubtful authority and applied only to Confederate regions not then conquered. But it was also done as a war measure to improve the Union's prospects for winning the war in the face of military reverses during the summer of 1862. Heck, the Confederates did the same thing in January of 1865 when things looked bad for them. If not for those battlefield setbacks, the ones in the summer of 1862, Lincoln might never have issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Moreover, when he finally did release it, he may have intended for it to provoke a slave rebellion in the Confederacy as a way to win the war. And historians don't talk much about that. In fact, it's almost never discussed. But it was a reality. It was a reality. It may well have been his intent. Such an event could have caused the massacre of many women and children left home defenseless, while their male relations served with the frontline Confederate armies. When the summer of '62 began, the Confederacy appeared to be on the verge of collapse. The first 6 months of the war brought federal victories at Mill Springs, Fort Donelson, Glorieta Pass, Pea Ridge, Shiloh, Island Number 10, and New Orleans in the Western Theater. Union armies threatened outnumbered Confederates in Mississippi and in eastern Tennessee. Chattanooga, the gateway to Atlanta, appeared likely to fail. Federal prospects were also quite good in the east, where Major General George McClellan besieged the Confederate capital with the largest army ever assembled in the Western Hemisphere. Unless McClellan can be driven out of his entrenchments, wrote General Robert E. Lee to Lieutenant General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, he will move by positions under cover of his heavy guns within shelling distance of Richmond. Thereafter, it would be only a matter of time before the city would need to be evacuated. But the unexpected did happen. In a week of fighting starting on June 26 of 1862, Lee relentlessly drove McClellan back 20 miles to a defensive redoubt on the James River. In the west, rebel armies under Lieutenant Generals Edmund Kirby Smith and General Braxton Bragg, moved into Kentucky, where they decisively won 2 victories in August and September. In mid-July, McClellan's setbacks had so worried Lincoln that the president felt, quote, that we had about played our last card and must change tactics or lose the game, close quote. Now, how is that any different than the Confederacy's 11th hour decision to free the slaves if they would volunteer to serve in the Confederate Army? I don't see much difference. Now, let me continue. The result was the Emancipation Proclamation. The result of Lincoln's quote about, losing the game was the Emancipation Proclamation. On the advice of Secretary of State Seward, Lincoln resolved that he would not release it until the Union armies won a significant victory or had fought a battle in which they could claim some kind of a victory. And that finally happened on the 19th of September when Lee retreated from Sharpsburg, Maryland. When Lincoln first discussed the proclamation with his cabinet in July, now this is almost 2 months earlier, Treasury Secretary Chase felt it would be better to let the generals in the field implement emancipation as they advanced through the South, sector by sector. He wanted to avoid the possible, quote, depredation and massacre, close quote, of civilians. Lincoln himself was undeniably aware of possible civilian massacre. If you look at the history in the antebellum period, there were slave uprisings in the Caribbean. The most notable one was in Haiti, where almost all of the whites that remained, about 5,000, almost all of them were massacred after blacks took over the government. When meeting with, and that happened in the early 19th century, and then of course there were later ones like, what's his name? The Virginia slave uprising by the Virginia slave that was kind of a mentally unbalanced preacher who had visions from God. What was his name? I can't recall it right now. When meeting with a group of, here's what Lincoln said when meeting with a group of Chicago abolitionists at the White House on the 13th of September, which was about 9 days before he released the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Nat Turner. I was thinking earlier of Nat Turner, who was the slave in Virginia in the early 1830s, who led an uprising against the whites, killed about 60 of them before he was his little band of insurrectionists were captured. And they, of the 60 they had killed, most of them were women and children. So this fear of massacre in the South is genuine. So let's get on now. Here's Lincoln meeting with Chicago abolitionists at the White House on the 13th of September, about 9 days before he announced the Emancipation Proclamation. Quote, understand, I raise no objections against emancipation on legal or constitutional grounds, for as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy in time of war, I suppose I have a right to take any measures which may best subdue the enemy. Nor do I urge objections to emancipation of a moral nature in view of possible consequences of insurrection and massacre at the South. I view this matter as a practical war measure to be decided on according to the advantages and disadvantages it may offer to the suppression of the rebellion. That's what he called the war between the states. Following the proclamation's official release on the 22nd of September, many condemned it as an attempt to provoke a slave rebellion. Unsurprisingly, that was the common reaction in the South, where Confederate President Jefferson Davis opined that the document, quote, encouraged slaves to a general assassination of their masters, close quote. But similar reactions were not uncommon in the North, partly because the proclamation included a statement that said, quote, U.S. military and naval authority will do no act to repress slaves or any efforts those slaves may make for their actual freedom, close quote. Many critics of that phrase, or that sentence, many critics interpreted that statement as an order for the federal military to do nothing, to stand down, not to protect Southern civilians should a slave rebellion arise. Boston maritime mogul and friend to abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner of that same state, Robert Forbes, the maritime mogul, concluded that Sumner's followers genuinely wanted the slaves to, quote, be made free by killing or poisoning their masters and mistresses, close quote. U.S. Representative Thaddeus Stevens, who was a primary abolitionist leader and chief architect of the postbellum Reconstruction, validated Forbes' conclusion by later admitting a hope that the slaves would be, quote, incited to insurrection and give the rebels a taste of real civil war, close quote. Similarly, the Continental Monthly of New York urged that a, quote, 1,000 mounted men, close quote, be recruited to raid deep into the South with the authority to assemble and arm the slaves, close quote. Finally, Senator Sumner himself said, quote, I know of no principle by which our Southern white rebels should be saved from the natural consequences of their own action. They set the example of insurrection. They cannot complain if their slaves follow it. Yeah, but they didn't go around massacring women and children. The Confederates and the men in the Confederate Army did not go around massacring women and children. And it's amazing that Sumner would say that that kind of conduct is okay. But he did. Or at least he certainly implied it. Colonel Charles Francis Adams Jr., Colonel Charles Francis Adams Jr., who was the son of Lincoln's ambassador to Great Britain and the great-grandson and grandson of two U.S. presidents, concluded that the prevailing belief in the North at the time of the Emancipation, was that the proclamation would spark an immediate slave uprising to bring the war to a sudden end by forcing the Confederate soldier to return home to protect his family. Union Major General George McClellan similarly complained that the president sought to stir up slave rebellions as a way to end the war. McClellan cannot be dismissed as some member of the lunatic fringe or isolated example. Now, let's keep in mind, he would become Lincoln's opponent for the presidential election in 1864, about 2 years later. And he received in that election 45% of the popular vote, notwithstanding that the Republican administration, Lincoln's administration, manipulated the soldier vote in his favor. According to historian Howard Jones, initial reaction to the Emancipation Proclamation, initial reaction that the Emancipation Proclamation might provoke slave rebellions, was also common in Europe, even though Lincoln mistakenly anticipated it would gain sympathy for the Union overseas. The Europeans, however, worried that it could trigger a race war that would extend beyond America's borders. Instead of concluding that emancipation gave the United States the moral high ground, Jones writes, quote, what developed was not the debate Lincoln expected over the morality of slavery, but a deep fear among the British leaders that the president's move would stir up slave rebellions. The result, they predicted, would be a race war that crossed sectional lines and, contrary to Lincoln's intentions, forced other nations to intervene in the American Civil War, close quote. Similarly, Jones writes of the opinion held by the French minister to Washington, Henri Mercier, I think it is, quote, like the British, Mercier concluded that the Union's expected demand for immediate emancipation would spark a race war that disrupted the Southern economy and stopped the flow of cotton. Such a conflict would spread beyond sectional boundaries and drag in other nations. William Stewart's the charge d'affaires in Washington, the British charge d'affaires in Washington said, quote, there is no pretext of humanity about this proclamation. It is cold, vindictive, and entirely political. It does not abolish slavery where it has the power. It protects the institution for friends and only abolishes it on paper for its enemies. It offers direct encouragement to servile insurrections. Similar opinions were echoed by a number of prominent British and French newspapers. The London Times questioned whether, quote, the reign of Lincoln's presidency was to go out amid the horrible massacres of white women and children, to be followed by the extermination of the black race in the South. That was actually a rhetorical question. The extermination of the black race in the South was basically an implication that it would be the backlash that would follow the massacre of white women and children in the South by slave uprisings in the South. All of this stirred up by the Emancipation Proclamation. Was this the true objective of the Emancipation Proclamation? There's good evidence that it may well have been. According to historian Jones, the French conservative press thought the proclamation, quote, the French conservative press, quote, thought the proclamation would cause slave rebellions and a fratricidal war that would envelop America in blood and ruin. Many concluded that the proclamation was not genuinely aimed at ending slavery, but at the South. The London Spectator wrote, quote, the principle of this proclamation is not that a human being cannot justly own another, but that he cannot own him unless he is loyal to the United States. As events evolved and no servile or insurrection ensued, European apprehension subsided. In time, Lincoln was able to win the moral high ground with posterity, as well as contemporary Europeans. While it is impossible to be certain of his intentions regarding servile insurrection, there is an important difference in the language between the Emancipation Proclamation of September 22nd, 1862, and the final one issued about 3 months later on January 1st, 1863. Lincoln added the following paragraph to the final version, which was missing altogether from the earlier one. Quote, and I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence, unless in necessary self-defense. And I recommend to them that in all cases, when allowed, they labor faithfully for reasonable wages. So the point is, why was that statement missing from the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation? Why? If he was not trying to stir up slave rebellions, why did he not include that in the September 22nd version? There's two interpretations. One is he just simply forgot or overlooked the point. The second is he deliberately, his September 22nd Emancipation Proclamation was a deliberate attempt to stir up slave insurrections and massacre of women and children in the South, white women and children. And those are the two interpretations you can make, maybe somewhere in between. I guess those are the three options. But you can't rule out any of them without making a good case for it. And the quotes I've made here indicate that, Lincoln would not have been disappointed if the slaves had gone into revolt. Okay, let me just take my notes out and see if I've got anything else to do here. Don't say it. Okay, I guess you can see me okay. Thanks for watching. And until next time, again, click that notification bell. You'll know when next time is. But I want to thank you for watching. And until next time, this is Philip Lee, and I'll see you next time.